My name is Ewan. I was 34 years old when I made the worst decision of my life. I am a geologist by trade, a man who believes in the cold logic of rock and sediment, not in the whispered warnings of superstitious old men. But the Highlands of Scotland have a way of humbling even the most rational minds, and what happened to me on the shores of Loch Morar, the deepest freshwater loch in all of Britain, changed me in ways I still cannot explain. It started with a research contract. A private energy firm wanted survey data on the loch bed, suspecting there might be geothermal potential beneath those ancient black waters. I was to spend 2 weeks camped on the western shore, taking readings, drilling small core samples from the bank, and cataloguing whatever I found. Simple enough, or so I thought. The locals in the nearest village, a scattering of cottages called Bracora, were not hostile when I arrived, but they were watchful. An old man named Dougal sat outside the post office every morning, and every morning he'd look at my equipment with the same tight expression. On my 3rd day, he stopped me. "You're drilling near the stones," he said. Not a question, a statement, and not a comfortable one. I told him I was just doing survey work. He looked at me for a long moment, then said very quietly, "Morag doesna like the stones being disturbed. She's sleeping. Don't wake her." I knew of the legend of Morag, the creature said to inhabit Loch Morar, Scotland's answer to Nessie. I smiled politely and went back to my camp. I wish I had listened. On the 5th night, I heard something I cannot account for. A low, rhythmic sound from the water, not quite a splash, not quite a groan, somewhere between the two. I climbed out of my tent with my headlamp and walked to the bank. The loch was completely still, glassy and black as oil, but there were marks in the silt at the water's edge, long, deep furrows, 3 of them, each one wider than my forearm, dragged from the water and stopping just short of my camp. Something had come out of the loch, and it had stopped at the edge of my tent. I told myself it was an otter, a large otter, or drag marks from a fallen tree. I'm a scientist. I catalogued possible explanations the way I'd catalogue rock samples. But then I found the stone. It was on my 6th day, partially buried in the bank sediment near my 3rd drilling site. A flat grey stone about the size of a dinner plate, covered with carvings, spirals and interlocking lines that I'd later learn bore resemblance to Pictish symbols, the ancient markings of a pre-Christian people who lived in these lands thousands of years before history as we know it began. Without thinking, God, why didn't I think? I bagged it. A specimen, evidence, something to show my colleagues. That night, the sounds returned, louder, closer. I lay in my sleeping bag with my headlamp pressed to my chest, and I listened to something move in the darkness outside. It circled my tent once, twice. I counted 7 full circles before it stopped, and then, directly outside the tent door, I heard breathing. Deep, wet, slow breathing, like the kind that doesn't come from a human chest. I did not sleep. When dawn finally broke, I crawled outside to find the grass around my tent had been flattened in a perfect ring, as if something enormous had been coiling around it all night. I left that stone on the bank. I left most of my equipment. I drove to Bracora, and I sat in my car until my hands stopped shaking. Dougal was outside the post office when I pulled up. He looked at my face, and he nodded slowly, like a man who has seen this before. "Did you put it back?" he asked. I told him I had. "Then you'll be all right, probably." I drove home to Edinburgh that day. I submitted my survey data, the data I had before the 5th night, and told the firm the geothermal potential was negligible. I don't know if that was true. I don't care. Some things should stay buried beneath those ancient black waters. I still hear that breathing sometimes, on quiet nights, when I've had too much whiskey and the flat is too dark. That slow, wet, patient breathing, like something that waited 10,000 years beneath a Scottish loch, has decided it doesn't mind waiting a little longer.
My name is Fergus. I'm a history teacher. I've spent 20 years teaching the Glencoe massacre to secondary students, a night in February 1692 when government soldiers turned on the MacDonald clan they had sheltered with, slaughtering 38 men, women and children in their sleep. I thought I knew that history completely. I was wrong. There are things about that glen that history books do not record, and things about that place that I wish I had never discovered. I went to Glencoe on a research trip, alone, a few years ago. I was writing a paper on the psychological legacy of the massacre, how trauma echoes through communities and landscapes across centuries. I'd arranged to stay in a cottage on the valley floor, right in the shadow of those brooding peaks that the Gaels called Bdien Nambian, the summit of the peaks. The glen is not a comfortable place even in summer. The mountains close in on all sides, steep and dark, and there's a quality to the light, or perhaps to the absence of light, that makes the air feel heavy and watched. Locals will tell you with absolute seriousness that the glen is haunted, not metaphorically, literally, and after what I experienced, I'm no longer inclined to argue. On my second evening, I was walking the old military road through the valley when I saw a woman standing at the far end of the bridge that crosses the River Coe. She wore dark clothing, and her hair was loose, hanging over her face, and she was very still, too still. I assumed she was a tourist like me, perhaps taking in the view. I raised my hand in greeting as I approached. She turned to look at me, and I stopped walking. Her face was wrong. I don't know how else to put it. The proportions were wrong, and her eyes, even from that distance, were entirely black. No whites, no iris, just two holes where eyes should be. And she was weeping, silently, copiously weeping, tears streaming down her face that was not quite a face. Then the mist came in from the east, not gradually, instantly. One moment the valley was clear, the next I was inside a dense grey wall of fog. When it lifted, perhaps 2 minutes later, the bridge was empty. The woman was gone. I told myself it was the light, or the stress of the drive, or the several drams of whiskey I'd had for dinner. But that night I mentioned it to the woman who ran the local shop, an older lady named Moira, and her face went completely still. "You saw the Caontach, the weeping woman," she said. She lowered her voice as though the word itself might carry somewhere dangerous. She was the last survivor of the night. She wandered the glen for weeks in the snow, too broken to know where to go. They say she finally sat down in the heather and wept herself to death, but she never left. She's still here, and she only appears to outsiders who come to disturb the memory of that night. I asked what it meant to be shown her. Moira looked at me a long time before answering. "It means she's marked you. Just be careful you didn't accept anything from her. Did she offer you anything? Try to hand you anything?" I thought of the bridge and shook my head. No, she had only looked at me. "Then you'll carry a heaviness for a while, a sorrow that isn't yours, but it should pass." She paused. Should. She was right. For 3 months after I returned home, I carried a grief inside my chest that had no source. I would wake at 3 in the morning with tears on my face and no memory of a dream. My wife thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I was. But I know what I saw on that bridge. I know the quality of that sorrow. It was not mine. It was a 200-year-old grief, and it climbed inside me like a parasite, and it fed on me until it had taken enough. On the last night I cried myself awake, I heard something outside our bedroom window, something softly, endlessly, heartbreakingly weeping in the garden. In the morning, every flower in the garden was dead, frost-burned in the middle of August. I never went back to Glencoe, but some nights I still feel her, sitting just at the edge of my perception, weeping for a clan that was butchered in their sleep 3 centuries ago. Some sorrows are too vast for one lifetime to contain. My name is Callum. I was 26 years old, and I thought I was invincible, the way only young men can think. I was a keen hiker, well-equipped, experienced, and utterly dismissive of what I called folk superstition. The West Highland Way is one of Scotland's most famous long-distance walking routes, 96 miles from Milgavie to Fort William, and the most dramatic section, the stretch over the Glencoe Plateau, includes a switchback ascent the old drovers and soldiers named the Devil's Staircase. I'd done it twice before. I knew the path. What I didn't know was that there is a cairn at the summit, built by hands far older than any map I'd studied, and that you do not, under any circumstances, take a stone from it. I reached the summit just before noon in a clear October day. The views were extraordinary. The entire Rannoch Moor stretched out to the east, that vast, empty, alien bogland, and the peaks of Glencoe to the south, and in every direction that particular Highland enormity that makes you feel simultaneously humbled and electric. I stopped at the cairn to eat and rest. There was a loose stone at its base, a good smooth piece of dark Highland quartzite, small enough to fit in my palm. I knew it was a cairn stone. I told myself that one stone from a pile of hundreds wouldn't matter. People leave cairns all over this mountain. What's one stone? I put it in my pack. For the next 3 hours, nothing happened. I descended the staircase, crossed the valley towards Kinloch Leven, followed the path through the forest above the town. But as the afternoon light began to drain and the shadows came in under the trees, I became aware of a sound behind me. Footsteps. I turned. Nothing on the path. I walked on, and they resumed, matching my pace precisely, one set of footsteps, maintaining maybe 30 feet of distance. I stopped. They stopped. I started. They started. By the time I reached Kinloch Leven, my mouth was dry, and my heart was hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the exertion. I booked into the hostel, took a hot shower, told myself it was sound carrying oddly in the forest, acoustics, echo. But at 2 in the morning, I woke to the feeling of being watched. I was in a 4-bed dorm room. The other 3 beds were occupied by hikers. But at the door, in the corner of the room, was a shape. A darkness, slightly darker than the rest of the darkness, roughly the shape of a standing man, but too tall, slightly wrong in proportion, with a quality of stillness that no living thing achieves. It was looking at me. I lay completely frozen, the way you go completely still when every animal instinct screams danger at once. I lay there for what felt like an hour, and it did not move, did not breathe, just stood there in the dark and looked at where I lay. When dawn broke and the room filled with gray light, it was gone, but the stone was sitting on the floor beside my bed. I had left it in my pack. The pack was still zipped, but the stone was on the floor. I threw it in the river on my way out of town. I didn't sleep for 2 days, and for 3 weeks afterwards I saw it, that too tall, dark shape in the corner of rooms, at the edge of car parks, down long corridors, always at a distance, always still, always watching. It stopped when I went back. I'm not ashamed to say it. I drove back up to the Devil's Staircase alone on a Saturday in November, climbed to the summit in wind and horizontal rain, and I replaced the stone exactly where I had found it. I stood there and said out loud to no one and everything that might be listening, "I'm sorry, it's back, I'm sorry." On the drive home, I watched the rearview mirror every mile. Nothing followed me. The Highland people have a word, guess. It means a binding curse, a prohibition, a supernatural injunction that attaches itself to an action. You don't take from the high places, you don't disturb what was placed, and if you do, if you're young and arrogant and scientific and dismissive, something comes to collect. I believe in guess now, with everything I am. The Highlands are not empty wilderness. They are very, very old, and they remember. And the things that remember them are patient in ways that human language has no words for. Whatever you do, if you ever walk those ancient paths, leave the stones where they lie.